It's such a pleasure to be here, although I will admit a little challenging to come from North America and feel like we have anything that we can tell you that you're not already doing. But I think I've been set up. We admire everything that's happening in Scandinavia. You are the examples that we point to, both from a planning perspective as well as a building and architecture perspective. But I think I've been set up in a very handy way by Brian's talk and your very excellent questions. Most of the time today I want to talk about the Humbertown project that Jenny mentioned, which is something I've been involved with for many years now and many years to come. But I thought it would be helpful to put that in context. And really it is all about what is happening in Ontario, and in particular the Greater Toronto area and what we sometimes call the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which stretches from Toronto around Lake Ontario down to the US border. Before I do that, I thought I would just localize you so I feel a little bit more at home. But this is our office in Toronto. We occupy the Heritage Building in the middle of the photo, the top 2 floors of this building. We have a streetcar running in a dedicated right-of-way right in front of our building on Spadina Avenue, which again I know is not a big deal here, but in North America that's pretty significant, and Torontonians love our streetcars. You can also see in the middle of the picture at our front door the kind of evidence of our burgeoning bicycle culture. Again, not something that is impressive here, but in a winter city like Toronto, in a North American context, it's something that we're really relying on as a step to a more positive future than we have currently been occupying for the last several decades. Urban Strategies is located in Toronto, but we've had the great good fortune of working all over the world, the United Kingdom in particular, all over North America, starting to work in Asia, and some lucky members of our firm get to work in the Caribbean, particularly in wintertime. We work at a range of scales, everything from working with design teams. I'm a planner, I think that was said, so my background is more policy planning than it is in specific design, but I work in integrated teams with designers. So we work on everything from, as an example, at the top, the second image in from the right is the Frank Gehry redo of the Art Gallery of Ontario, located just around the corner from our office. So there we helped negotiating complex approvals for the project. Everything through to, as an example, on the bottom, the second image in from the left is the Silvertown Quays area just beyond Canary Wharf lands in London, the London Docklands. So at all scales, one of the founding kind of principles of our work is engagement with the communities where we are planning. So again, evidence of that here. Obviously, the success of the kinds of change that we're working collaboratively to create must be rooted in the communities in which they will be developed. So now back to context, managing growth in Ontario. There we go. About a decade ago, the province of Ontario, which is the governing jurisdiction that Toronto is located within, initiated 3 interrelated sets of policy initiatives, and they very much speak to the earlier question about how do we manage footprint, how do we contain sprawl. Ontario, driven by massive immigration in the Toronto environment, has been growing exponentially. We had no recession when the rest of the world suffered after the 2008 world financial crisis. We have been growing and growing and growing, and I'll show you some stats in a little while. So it, again, in a very progressive way, one of the very few, if not only, examples of this kind of integrated planning in North America, have we actually created 3 sets of connected legislation. The first is the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which is shown on the left, which is enabled by the Places to Grow Act. Almost at the same time, there was the institution of a Greenbelt Act, so literally a green lung designated in perpetuity around the Greater Golden Horseshoe as the way to both contain sprawl, but also preserve natural lands in their functioning performance. So much along the lines of what Brian talked about in terms of the role that they can play in mitigating urban heat island effects. And then the third piece is something called the big move, which is how to invest strategically in transit to be able to support this intended constraining and densification of the urban environment. So when you put these 3 things together, you get the image that you see here. We can see the massive green belt. It's about 2 million acres, about 750,000 square hectares of land, so massive. Agricultural is allowed within this green belt, as well as preservation in a natural state and a whole series of conservation efforts around maintaining the land in that natural performative state. What that does then is encourage growth to happen within the Greenbelt, with a few exceptions. You can see based on historic settlements that there is growth beyond the Greenbelt. But for the most part, very much specifically influenced to be inside the Greenbelt. And even more importantly, for the significant majority of that development to occur through reurbanization and intensification in the already built boundary. It's the language that we use, but that's essentially the land indicated in purple. That already built boundary has a whole variety of characteristics. So some of it is very urban, like the City of Toronto's downtown. Some of it is very suburban. All of that is in play and intended to be intensified over time, and the Humbertown project is one example of where we have been working to do that. There are minimum densities that have been established regardless of where you are developing in the Greater Toronto area. So if you are in the built boundary, there are expectations of a higher minimum density than exists today. In the few places where you can build on what we call greenfield land, so the areas between the purple and the kind of flesh tone, the flesh tone color between the purple and the greenbelt, there again are minimum densities so that the new suburbs that are being built will be much more compact than what has been built in the last decades since World War II. And then interestingly, the little yellow dots indicate what we call our urban growth centers. So these are either existing downtowns or the places where high-order transit exists today or where it could be brought in a very kind of strategic way. And so again, these are the places where the most amount of growth will be concentrated, and many of these are in suburban locations, which right now can be characterized by what we call power center, so very low format retail development as an example of something which is now going to be transformed into a much more urban fabric. So within this framework of massive growth in Ontario, we're going to talk in the next little bit of the presentation about what's happening in Toronto. And this is just one image. This is in our downtown, but it gives you a sense. We have built, I'm not sure the exact number, but hundreds of towers in the last 10 years. Most of them for residential purposes, but we are beginning to come back and build office and employment towers as well. But this pattern of tower development is pushing to new heights. You know, many of our towers now are in the 80-story range, taller than what's happening in most cases in New York City, certainly in most cases in Europe. And I'm not sure everybody completely understands how this phenomenon has occurred, but a lot of people associate it with the intention to control growth. This is happening beyond the downtown as well. So within the framework of provincial legislation, all municipalities have to comply with the province's framework of growth management. The City of Toronto, this is the cover of its official plan, has been very proactive. This planning document was prepared before compliance was required with the Places to Grow Act, because Toronto has been growing very significantly for decades already. But through this work, which we'll see in a couple of slides in a moment, is an intention to further increase the population by 30% in the next 25 years. So effectively accommodating 50,000 new residents per year, which is like adding a small city every year inside the bigger city. The way this will be accomplished is by imagining a new vision for how Toronto will be structured. For those of you who may know Toronto, one of the things it's most famous for, in addition to its streetcars, is its neighborhoods. So Torontonians are very attached to the neighborhoods in which they live. Those are shown by the sort of most predominant land use in this image, the pale kind of yellow color. So there will definitely be places where not much growth is encouraged, and the neighborhoods, for the most part, are those places. So where will this massive increase of population, the extra 50,000 people a year, be accommodated? And the answer is in centers. So our downtown is indicated in the orange color, which includes our central waterfront, which is also in the process of being massively redeveloped as a post-industrial landscape, which is now going to be a kind of mixed-use set of communities, very much led by investment in the public realm. Then beyond that, there'll be intensification in centers shown in red, which are the historic centers of the original cities that now comprise the bigger City of Toronto. And the final category, which is one of the things that we'll talk more about, are avenues, which are many of them are the historic streetcar streets. Some of them are places in the suburbs where future light rail transit is intended. But really the idea that corridor-based development and a connection between land use and transit investment is the way to accommodate so much of this growth. I'm going to show you on the next slide a little bit of a zoom in of this area. which is nearby where the Humbertown site is located. And what's most, I think, helpful is to pay attention to the red area, because we're going to switch the nature of the map and look at the finer grain of land use. So it's not, the detail is not important here. It's really what I want to emphasize is the relationships. So I didn't bring the pointer with me, but the red area at the bottom is that same area we looked at, which in simple terms is one of the places where the City of Toronto is encouraging change. So a mixed use area. Not all of this is currently mixed use. In fact, much of it is single purpose, post-industrial use. But the intention is that it should be developed in a very integrated way at a much higher density. What I wanted to show you with this is the fact that all of these areas of change have very intimate relationships with the neighborhoods that are behind them. So transition is one of the city's greatest challenges in terms of how do you accommodate major new growth in much more dense building formats immediately adjacent to low-rise neighborhoods that people value very much and associate with the quality of life of living in Toronto. So there are a variety of tools for that. One of them is the Tall Building Guidelines. This is the third iteration of Tall Building Guidelines in the City of Toronto. Our office had the great opportunity to work with the city in creating this latest set of guidelines, which is very much about where do those hundreds of towers that we've been building, where do they go? Also, equally importantly, is where do they not go? So where should they not be located? Once the decision is made about where do they go, how do they relate both to each other, because they do tend to want to cluster in Toronto, and how do they relate to their context? So that's the image on the bottom left showing important relationships between small tower footprints. That's one of the major things that Toronto has been looking to control so that you have very quick moving shadows and good sky view. So while the towers have become very tall, they have very tiny kind of footprints. Separation distances between the towers is really important, again, for quality of light and sky view and just a feeling of openness in this increasingly dense environment. And then transition down from the top of the tower into the context that either exists or is planned. Looking at things like the contribution that a private development makes to the public realm, so where should the building be located on its site, how will it preserve a good quality of streetscape on the frontage, what will be the relationship between environmental performance considerations, like the bottom of this image, you can see the indication of green roofs and how that fits into the bigger picture of the tower's development. On the avenues and the kind of context that Humbertown is located in, which is one of those mixed-use site designations, an area of change, the scale is intended to be lower. Buildings are what we call mid-rise. When they are on the avenues, the relationship between the height of the building is very directly correlated to the width of the street, the right-of-way, so a kind of one-to-one relationship has been understood to be comfortable in terms of being able to support intense street-related development on each side of the road by making sure that you have appropriate setbacks, that you have good transitions, the angular planes that are indicated here. And then at the top, on the top right-hand side, you can see the transition in the rear to the neighborhoods that are immediately behind the avenues, as we talked about. There are a lot of other initiatives that Toronto is actively engaged in now in support of this kind of climate change. This is the green roof at Toronto's City Hall. Wanted just to show you some of the other things that we are doing. So Toronto was, I think, the first city in North America to institute a green roof bylaw. So any development of a significant, not actually all that significant, the threshold is 2,000 meters, 2,000 square meters in size, needs to provide between 20 and 60% of its roof area as a green roof, a performative green roof. And this is actually happening in a great, because of our building boom, we've been able to actually move the needle very significantly on this performance standard. The other thing that is required is compliance with the Toronto Green Development Standard, which is a process that looks at everything from building materials to waste management during the construction process to the environmental and energy performance of the building in its lifespan. Things like vegetative responses to greening the site, movement, so the provision of alternative forms of transportation. So it's a system which actually works hand in hand with what we use in North America, the LEED system, very compatible. So all projects are required to do what's called Tier 1 of the Green Development Standard. Many are encouraged to go to the next level, which is a little more consistent with LEED Gold, which is Tier 2. And in exchange for that, there are financial incentives in terms of credits from the development levies that otherwise would need to be paid. Another very interesting program is the Tower Renewal program. So Toronto has approximately 1,000, we call them our concrete towers, in an inner ring of suburbs that sort of runs around the middle band of the city. They were built in the 1950s and 60s in Toronto's last major residential boom. I think the format is quite familiar. They literally are towers in a park. They're beginning to fail from a kind of mechanical perspective. A lot of challenges in terms of energy performance. So part of this program is the opportunity to seek funding and city-provided expertise to be able to update systems, update cladding, as you can see in the image on the bottom of the slide, but also to think about the way that these buildings function as part of the urban community. So right now, this form of development is very isolating, very separate, in many cases not served at all well by transit. So the image on the top, which is a little difficult to see at this scale, shows that there has been an effort to change the zoning permissions that apply to these tower neighborhoods to allow intensification on the ground plane to take away some of this vast expanse of green space and fill it in with new places to live, new places to work. A whole effort to encourage local small businesses, sort of entrepreneurialism to repopulate the ground plane, in some cases to begin by coming into the bases of these buildings and offering small shops. Access to food is a significant issue. I know that sounds kind of like it should be easy, but in this case, again, these can be in vast tracts of land which make it very difficult to walk to or take transit to places for local shopping requirements. So all of that is a kind of integrated theory in terms of how to bring these tower neighborhoods back into the city fabric in a more performative way. We've just appointed our first Sustainable Transportation Director, Hilary Holden, so everybody is very excited about that because despite the provincial initiative, the big move, we have had a very difficult time in Toronto making decisions for how to actually construct more sustainable forms of transportation. So I mentioned we have a growing bike culture. That is with almost no infrastructure and with a fairly challenging climate, very, very hot in the summer, very, very cold in the winter, and yet people are cycling. So I think that if we were able to get ourselves to the next step and really build the infrastructure that will make that a powerful contributor to mobility, then we will be very successful and entirely possible. So now coming back to ground, the project I mentioned that I was going to talk about, which is called Humbertown. And this is an image which we'll come back to a little later in the presentation. But just to locate us within that bigger context that we started off with, the Humbertown site is located within the city of Toronto, but at the western end, definitely in a suburban context. It's in one of the very treed suburbs that was built after World War II, a very affluent suburb, which has had not a lot of change. So this proposal was a series of conversations over many years about what form that change could take to contribute to the community, but also make this particular site much more contemporary and performative in a whole variety of ways along the lines of what we're talking about today. So this is one of the images we like to show. When Humbertown was built, it was a kind of model of its time in North America where shopping was taken off the local streets and put into a dedicated sort of place. It was very exciting to be able to get in your car and drive somewhere to shop, so completely different from the shopping patterns before and also what we're now seeking to strive where people do not have to do that. So this is the site today. The main shopping plaza is on the left-hand side in the kind of triangular size part of the site, bisected by a street called the Kingsway, which is important. We'll come back to that. You can see that the majority of this site is either black or gray. Brian talked about asphalt. That's what this site is entirely about. It's either paved surfaces for parking cars or hard asphalt roofs that right now have no water mitigation or heat island mitigation at all happening on them. And yet you can see that the context is very green. Toronto is a highly treed city. I can't recall the specific statistics, but we have one of the densest tree canopies of North American cities. And so Humbertown, while it is a suburban setting, is definitely characterized by its tree cover. So like all good planners, we look to Jane Jacobs for inspiration in terms of the vision. And I think what's most important here is that rather than a single land use purpose, which is what Humbertown is today, the vision was to provide a whole range of things happening. And again, you need to remember that this is in a suburban context, not immediately evident that people in the Humbertown neighborhood would want to be able to do all of these things on a site such as this, which for decades has been dedicated just to shopping. So the goal is to take a site which does not make great use of infrastructure. One of the other major drivers of the provincial focus on growth management is to make best possible use of existing investment in infrastructure. So whether that be water resources that have been provided, road networks that have been provided. The Humbertown site is used only a few hours of the day. The goal is to make sure that it is a dynamic community used at all hours of the day by people at all different levels of their, at all different stages of their lifespan, so that it is truly active and mixed use, the Humbertown mix. How do we do this? Because essentially we're creating a brand new sense of place, trying to completely reimagine the way that the site is organized. The first step is to identify a series of blocks, so to break down those two parcels on either side of the Kingsway into 5 development blocks, to center the development around a new village square, really as the heart of the existing Humbertown community, but also of this new development. To recognize the Kingsway as the extension of that village square and the new Main Street or High Street, the place for community activity as well as retail activity. To think about how open spaces will integrate the site into the existing neighborhood, but also connect all of the various components of this new mixed-use development together. So one of those elements is the Humber Line, which a little shamelessly takes its inspiration from the High Line in New York. It was very exciting at the time that this was planned. But the idea of the Humber Line is to transition between, there's a significant grade change on the site. It's about 1.5 stories taller on the west than it is on the east. So the Humber Line both provides connection across the site, but also allows the architects to mediate between the fact that there will be a change in grade where the retail and community spaces are located from west to east on the site. So pretty interesting for a variety of reasons. The redevelopment provided the opportunity to deal with some of the things on the site that the community did find annoying, like the fact that servicing, so loading and truck servicing for the commercial uses, was exterior and not at all acoustically mitigated, so now it will be completely within the building structure. To think about the layering of land uses, so this will maintain its role as a major community retail center. In fact, the amount of commercial space will double, so it will be twice as important in terms of shopping patterns in the community as it is today, in part to continue serving the existing community, but also to recognize that there will be about 1,000 new residents on this site once development is complete, in a range of building forms. So there are townhouses, so grade-related housing, there are apartment blocks, as well as a seniors or retirement residence as part of this mix. So again, understanding that this can play a role for people at all spectrums of their life cycle. And the final is a big deal in the suburban context, which is that all of the parking is being pushed below grade, or almost all of the parking is being pushed below grade, which is a cultural challenge. A lot of people in the Humbertown neighborhood are older. The idea of parking in a garage is a little hard for them to get their mind around. So one of the key things are the 2 little icons, what we call lanterns, and I'll show you some images in a little while, that have been used to orient people on the site. So once you know you can see a lantern, you know that's the major entrance to the parking area, as well as the connection between these grade changes that I mentioned, the fact that the public spaces are on 2 different levels in the site. So the goal is to take this very non-performative, what we call a gray site, and transition it into a green site, which is much more fitting with this very green context that it's located in. And so you can see that here. An intense application of green roofs, green walls, high albedo surface materials, as Brian talked about in terms of the paving structures. So everything has been designed to be as performative as possible. Some of the statistics: there are 3 significant new residential buildings as well as the townhouses that I mentioned. There are almost a million, or sorry, the square feet, so almost 100,000 square meters of gross floor area, very significant new community effort. A lot of bicycle parking to balance the car parking, which is still required. The site is organized by a really comprehensive public realm. So right now, I think you got the sense in those earlier pictures, there is very little, almost no public space on the site today. It really is a parking lot. There are a few cafes that certainly are community focuses, but there's nowhere to actually come to the site, to sit on the grass, to sit on a bench, to watch urban life. And so that really has been the organizing device in a series of 4 different spaces, which I'll show you in a minute. But almost 20% of the site will now be publicly accessible and really intended to be the heart of this bigger initiative. So here, looking at an axonometric image, the idea that the Humber line, which runs across the top of the picture, will transition from west to east, connecting to all of the distinct spaces like the village square, which really is the sort of heart of the community, a set of steps, again, making that grade transition, providing a wonderful opportunity for a place to linger and people watch. Humber Court, which is at the front of the development and really the kind of transition from one of the other major arterial roads, which is the frontage of the site, Royal York Road, as a way to come into the site. Lambeth Community Green at the back of the site, which is a park space, although actually really more like a green roof because it is located above the building infrastructure and parking below grade. So feels like a park on the surface, but is actually a performative green roof. And the Humber Line, again, inspired by the New York High Line. So here's an image showing the range of development, and again, I think giving you a sense that not only visually, but functionally, the site will be dramatically more of a contributor to the urban context and a reduction of that heat island effect that Brian spoke about. We're looking here at the, I don't have a pointer, but on the bottom left-hand side is the Lambeth Community Green, the village square in the center, and moving out to Humber Court. You can see the scale is quite variable in the buildings. The tallest building is about 12 stories in height, following those mid-rise building guidelines that I showed you at the beginning. So here we're looking at the Humber Line on the right and the Lambeth Community Green on the left, and showing just how porous the site has been designed to be so that it provides a way to move from one side of the neighborhood to the other, and making this the real centerpiece for people's various different routes across their neighborhood. This is one of the 2 lanterns. This is the primary one, which connects to the community green on the top left-hand side of the image, straight down to the public level of underground parking. Also making the transition between the public spaces above on the 2nd level and the village square, which you can see on the bottom of the image. And really iconic and intended to help people find their way around the site. You know, I'll meet you at the lantern is the kind of, we had a bit of a tour of Lund when we first came, and I understand that people say that we'll meet you in front of the bookstore, I think it was, but this is intended to be the kind of landing spot for people who will make arrangements in Humbertown. And here you can see trying to daylight the parking garages, make them as comfortable as possible for people who are not used to parking in a garage setting. The ability to see the sky through the lantern is a pretty important objective. Looking here at the village square with one of the tallest, this is the largest residential building. This is not actually representative of the final architecture. It was a presentation rendering done during the process, but it does give you a sense of the way the Humber Line comes down to meet the village square. And some of its many environmental features. So rather than being car focused, it is very much about the pedestrian, very human in its orientation and scale, a very strong focus on access to transit, a variety of cycling facilities, extensive green roofs, the use of a whole variety of indigenous plant materials, the discussion earlier about how you choose species, so very careful intention to create a very diverse plant environment here so that it has the ability to flourish over time, as well as a whole variety of strategies to manage rainwater on the site, so to collect it, to use it to establish the trees in their early years, and to also provide collection and management of rainwater so as not to surcharge the city's sewer system, which has a variety of stresses. One of the other things I think I didn't mention is that there will be, I believe, 5 times as many trees on the site once this is developed. And one of the very progressive things that is being accomplished is any existing tree of a significant size and character is going to be maintained and transplanted out of the parking lots into the street, the surrounding street network. So that's been the subject of a lot of conversation, but very important aspiration. It's been a long process. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're very committed to working with the communities where our projects are being planned. There have been a whole variety of public meetings. This is one very angry one that we had to move our way through. More than 1,000 very unhappy people at the beginning. It's taken almost 4 years to secure the planning approvals for the project, and it will take at least another 6 to build it. So this is something that we've been astonished by. I understand that planning in Sweden is much more centralized, and so that may not be entirely positive, but you are able to affect change in a more rapid time frame than we are in Canada. But at the end of the day, a very successful outcome. We were needing to go to something called the Ontario Municipal Board, which is our kind of appeal court for planning matters, but there was a negotiated settlement between the community and our clients, and so now I think quite a lot of comfort and excitement around the movement forward on this project. And then just to bring it back to what's happening at the city level overall, you remember that structure drawing I showed you that indicated the centers, the downtown in the middle, and the avenues. You can see this is tracking the success of residential construction. Of course, there's a corollary drawing for non-residential construction, but you can see that the structure intentions of the city are very much being successful in terms of a way to organize development using those various tools for how to manage built form in a way that contributes positively to the communities that these new developments are located within. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Yes, I wonder what your best advice to all our students here for their future professional careers is how to persuade 1,200 angry NIMBYs that it's a good idea to develop their affluent society and making it change into something else that they are not feeling comfortable with.
It's a great question, and I don't know that I have an easy answer. Patience probably is one of the biggest skills that we need to have as planners, to understand that the reason that people are opposing change is because they love where they live, and that's important. And so you need to understand why. You need to respect the fact that that's what's driving their concern. You need to have a lot of conversation with the existing community about what is important to them. In this case, what did they feel is missing from the Humbertown neighborhood today, and what could this new development offer to them? So that is actually one of the reasons why the significant seniors housing component came into the development. So that was not something that was initially proposed. Similarly, the nature of the underground parking garage, which seems like a sort of small thing, but that was the topic of incredible conversation. And those of you who were watching very carefully may have noticed that what I call the village square actually has a small surface parking lot in the middle of it. It accommodates about 50 parked cars. Wasn't a preference of everybody that that be maintained, but it is an example that really, I think, as a cultural shift, the neighborhood needed to feel like not everything about their shopping experience at Humbertown was changing right away, so that this idea that you could still park within the crescent of the retail kind of realm that's being developed was a little bit of a touchstone for them. So I hope that is a small kind of answer. Lots and lots of conversation.
I wonder how you work with like the density parameter, especially in connection with a mixed use. Do you have like a target density which you for sustaining this mixed use?
That's another great question. I didn't talk a lot about the client for this project. So this project is being developed by a partnership client, so one of whom are the owners of the commercial shopping mall, so retail is what they do. And the other is the residential, a very significant residential developer in Toronto. So the two of them set the program, essentially. I think, as you might imagine, they initially wanted more than was ultimately secured through the approval process. But we got very close to what would make it financially feasible for them. This is a very expensive project just because all of the parking is being pushed below grade but will not be charged for. It will be free to those who are shopping on the site, so that is major. The level of environmental performance, which is the subject of today's conversation, all of that is expensive in the short term, and for residential developers, not always In Toronto, at least the kind of project that this is, it's sales. So the apartments are built, but then they're sold. And so the only way that you can actually recover cost in terms of the extensive investment is if you can sell the product for a price which will cover it. So that is a challenge still in terms of getting people's mindset that a higher starting price is worth it in the long run, because the buildings will be not only more pleasurable to live in, but also less expensive to operate. And it certainly appeals to a population with a certain mindset that actually really want to contribute to the environment. So the density in this case was set by the financial obligations of delivering a project of this quality within its context. But then still had to meet, sorry, I should just say still had to meet all of those guidelines that we talked about in terms of transition and impact, shadowing, transportation capacity, a whole series of tests that developments have to go through in the Toronto context.
I just want to ask the question a little differently.
Sure.
That was asked over here in the corner.
Yes.
I think the students might be interested to find out whether the green strategies actually helped in the persuasion and also helped in persuading the developers in doing something differently. Could you comment about that?
In this particular case, not so much, because our clients were very progressive already. They commit to building to a LEED Gold standard, which means a very high level of environmental performance. So in this particular case, the client already had an intention to do something very green. They intentionally chose an architectural team that was very oriented in that way. Certainly, though, from the perspective of getting the city's approval, it was fundamental. It was very, very important, because we not only met the requirements that were specified, as I summarized, the Green Roof Bylaw and the Toronto Green Development Standard, but exceeded them in many ways. So things, as I gave as an example, but the transplanting of mature trees from one part of the site to another, some of the more innovative treatments of the public realm in providing so much space as publicly accessible space, which I think of as part of the green strategy definitely, were fundamental to bringing the city's approval authority along, because it was difficult for them. We were breaking a lot of the zoning rules, if you will, and it needed to be something that people understood would be a net benefit for the community.